The year is 1965. A sociology professor at Berkeley stands before a packed auditorium and declares that traditional morality is dead. The students erupt in applause. 50 miles away, a mother of three reads the newspaper over breakfast, her coffee growing cold as she processes the headline, "God is dead, says Time magazine." She doesn't know it yet, but her grandchildren will grow up in a world she wouldn't recognize. They'll have more wealth, more education, more freedom than any generation in human history. They'll also have the highest rates of depression, anxiety, and loneliness ever recorded. What happened? How did the wealthiest, most educated, most scientifically advanced civilization in human history become one where people report feeling emptier than ever before? But here's what's truly unsettling. This isn't the first time this has happened. The pattern has repeated across millennia, from ancient Rome to the Weimar Republic, and if we don't understand it, we're condemned to watch it unfold again. Because what we're witnessing isn't progress or regression. It's a cycle as old as civilization itself. Let's go back further. Rome, 476 AD. The empire doesn't fall with a bang. There's no dramatic battle that ends it all. Instead, it dissolves like salt in water. The last emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, is quietly pensioned off by a Germanic chieftain. Historians would later argue for centuries about why Rome fell. Was it the barbarians? Economic collapse? Lead poisoning? But a Roman Christian writer named Salvian, who witnessed the collapse firsthand, had a different explanation. He wrote that Rome fell because Romans no longer believed in Rome. The circuses continued, the bathhouses remained full, the wine flowed freely, but something fundamental had eroded. The virtues that built the empire, discipline, duty, sacrifice for the common good, had become quaint relics, laughable to the sophisticated urbanite. Sound familiar? In the 2nd century AD, at Rome's height, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote his Meditations, a private journal never meant for publication. In it, this most powerful man in the world obsessively reminds himself to practice virtue, to control his desires, to serve rather than be served. Compare this to the aristocrats just 2 centuries later, who historian Ammianus Marcellinus described as caring only for the ripeness of their mushrooms and the temperature of their bathwater. What changed wasn't the external threats. Rome had always had those. What changed was internal. The Romans stopped believing that virtue mattered. But here's the fascinating part. Before the fall, there was tremendous optimism. The Romans of the 4th century had incredible technology for their time, advanced architecture, continent-spanning infrastructure, sophisticated entertainment. They were convinced they'd achieved the pinnacle of civilization. The philosopher Themistius in 364 AD gave speeches about how Rome would last forever, protected not by the old gods or old values, but by its superior culture and institutions. 15 years later, the Goths crossed the Danube. 100 years later, Rome was finished. Now, I'm not saying Western civilization is about to fall to barbarians, but I am asking you to consider this. What if our current moment isn't unprecedented? What if there's a pattern here we're missing because we're too close to see it? Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig into the patterns of history that explain our present. If you're finding value in this deep dive, consider leaving a super thanks. It genuinely helps us create more content like this. And I'm curious, where are you watching from and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing this global community come together around these ideas. Let's talk numbers, because this isn't just philosophy. In 1960, the United States was by virtually every metric at a peak. GDP was soaring, crime was at historic lows, 72% of adults were married, and only 5% of children were born outside of marriage. Church attendance was at an all-time high. Social trust, measured by surveys asking if most people can be trusted, was at 55%. Communities were tight-knit. Your word meant something. By 2020, those numbers had inverted. Crime rates had exploded between the 60s and 90s before settling at levels still higher than 1960. Marriage rates had plummeted. 40% of children were born to unmarried parents. Church attendance had been cut in half, and social trust down to 31%. Americans were literally half as likely to trust each other as they'd been 60 years earlier. But here's what the raw statistics miss: the psychological transformation. Sociologist Christian Smith conducted detailed interviews with young Americans in the 2000s for his book, Soul Searching. What he found was startling. The dominant religion among young people wasn't atheism or Christianity or any traditional faith. He called it moralistic therapeutic deism, a belief system that can be summarized as God exists, wants you to be nice and happy, doesn't need to be particularly involved in your life, and good people go to heaven. Morality had been reduced to be nice, feel good, you do you. This wasn't some conservative critic's caricature. This was rigorous sociological research. And it revealed something profound. Virtue had been replaced by vanity, by therapeutic self-affirmation. The classical virtues, courage, temperance, wisdom, justice, the Christian additions of faith, hope, and charity, these weren't about feeling good. They were often about feeling terrible in service of something greater. Courage means acting despite fear. Temperance means denying yourself pleasure. Justice often means personal sacrifice. These virtues built civilizations because they subordinated individual desire to collective flourishing. But something happened in the mid-20th century. The self became sacred. You do you became the highest moral principle. Your truth replaced the truth. Authentic self-expression trumped any external moral standard. In 1966, Time magazine ran that famous cover, "Is God Dead?" Inside, the article explored how modern theology itself was abandoning traditional morality. But they missed the deeper story. God wasn't dead. He'd been replaced. The new God was the self, and its temple was the mirror. Philip Rieff, one of the most brilliant sociologists of the 20th century, diagnosed this in his 1966 book, The Triumph of the Therapeutic. He argued that Western civilization had undergone a fundamental transformation. We'd moved from a culture oriented around renunciation and restraint to one oriented around release and self-actualization. The old question was, what must I give up to be good? The new question was, what makes me happy? This wasn't just a change in values, it was a change in the entire structure of meaning. In the old framework, you found meaning by connecting to something transcendent. God, country, family, tradition, moral law. Suffering had purpose because it could be redemptive, could serve something greater. In the new framework, suffering was just suffering. It had no meaning except as something to be eliminated through therapy, medication, or the affirmation of your feelings. And this is where it gets dark. Because when suffering has no meaning, when there's no transcendent purpose, when the self is the ultimate reference point, what happens when the self is unhappy? The statistics are chilling. Between 2007 and 2019, before COVID, the suicide rate among Americans aged 10 to 24 increased by 57%. Read that again. 10 to 24. The rate among young girls doubled. These were kids growing up with more material wealth, more opportunity, more rights, more freedom than any generation in history. And they were killing themselves at rates not seen since the Great Depression. Jean Twenge, a psychologist who studies generational differences, found that the increase correlated almost exactly with smartphone adoption. But it wasn't just screen time. It was what the screens represented: a culture of constant performance, constant comparison, constant pressure to craft the perfect image of yourself for validation from strangers. Virtue signaling, quite literally. The term we now use mockingly has a precise psychological reality. People performing moral positions not because they believe them, but because they signal group membership and status. Vanity, from the Latin vanitas, meaning emptiness, the pursuit of empty things. And what could be emptier than the dopamine hit of likes on a carefully curated post about how virtuous you are? But let's be precise here. This isn't about kids these days or simple generational scolding. The young people didn't create this world. They inherited it. we need to understand how we got here. The story really begins in the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment gave us incredible things: the scientific method, liberal democracy, human rights, the idea that reason rather than revelation should guide human affairs. But it also created a problem that we're still grappling with. It severed the connection between virtue and cosmic order. For ancient Greeks and Romans, for medieval Christians, virtue wasn't arbitrary. It was woven into the fabric of reality. Plato's forms, Aristotle's teleology, the Christian natural law, these all said, there's a right way to be human, written into nature itself. You don't get to choose your own truth any more than you get to choose your own gravity. The Enlightenment said, actually, maybe you do. Maybe morality isn't discovered but constructed. Maybe there's no cosmic order, just social contracts we agree to. And if that's true, why is my social contract better than yours? The philosophers tried to solve this. Kant said reason itself provides moral law. The utilitarians said maximize happiness. But these solutions had a problem. They worked great in philosophy seminars and terribly in actual human societies. Because people aren't rational calculators, we're tribal, emotional, status-seeking primates who need stories and rituals and sacred things to cohere into communities. When you strip away the sacred, you don't get rational individualists. You get anime. Emil Durkheim, the founder of sociology, coined this term in the 1890s to describe the condition of normlessness, when the shared moral framework breaks down and people don't know what's expected of them or what they can expect from others. And Durkheim found that anime was the single best predictor of suicide rates. In traditional societies, suicide rates were low. Everyone knew their place, their role, their duties. The framework was often oppressive, unjust, stifling, but it provided meaning. In modern societies, as traditional frameworks dissolved, suicide rates soared. And this was before social media, before smartphones, before the current crisis. Freedom, it turns out, is psychologically complicated. We crave it, and we're terrified of it. Because freedom means responsibility, means choice, means the possibility of failure with no one to blame but yourself. The existentialists understood this. Sartre said we're condemned to be free. Camus asked whether we should commit suicide in the face of life's absurdity, and spent his career arguing, no, we should rebel. We should create meaning despite the void. But how many people can sustain existential rebellion as a way of life? How many can stare into the void and not blink? Most people need the sacred, need to believe their choices matter not just subjectively but objectively, that there's a right way to live even if it's hard. So when the sacred was removed, people didn't become free, rational individuals. They became anxious, searching, desperate for something to fill the void. And into that void rushed consumerism, political tribalism, social media performance, and what we might call boutique identities, elaborate constructions of self based on consumption patterns, sexual identities, cultural affiliations, anything that could provide the sense of meaning and belonging that religion once did. But here's the cruel trick. These substitutes promise the benefits of traditional meaning systems without the costs. You can change your identity when it stops serving you. You can leave your tribe when it demands too much. Everything is fluid. Everything is choice. Everything is self-expression. It sounds liberating. In practice, it's isolating. Because communities require commitment, and commitment requires believing that some things are more important than your momentary happiness. In 1985, sociologist Robert Bellah published Habits of the Heart, a landmark study of American values. He interviewed hundreds of Americans about their beliefs, their communities, their commitments. What he found was a culture of radical individualism that had severed itself from the Republican and biblical traditions that once provided shared moral language. People could articulate what they wanted, but not why anyone else should care. They'd say things like, "It's just my opinion that murder is wrong, but that's just true for me." Bellah called this ontological individualism, the belief that the individual is the only real thing, that communities and moral standards are just arbitrary constructs. But here's the paradox. These same people were desperately lonely, desperately searching for community, desperately wanting their lives to matter, They just couldn't articulate any framework that would make that possible. One of Bella's subjects, a woman he called Sheila, described her faith as Sheilaism. Just my own little voice, she said. She believed in God, believed in being a good person, but it was all self-referential, all ultimately about her feelings. There were 220 million Americans at the time. Bella suggested there might be 220 million religions. This was 1985, before the internet, before social media, before the current crisis of meaning. Fast forward to today, and we have the infrastructure for infinite Sheilaisms. You can find your tribe online, no matter how niche. You can construct your identity from an endless buffet of options. You can live in an algorithmically curated bubble where everyone reflects your views back to you. This should be paradise, right? Ultimate freedom, ultimate self-expression, ultimate authenticity. Instead, we have an epidemic of depression, anxiety, and suicide. We have political polarization so severe that families break apart over it. We have conspiracy theories proliferating because people are so desperate for meaning they'll accept paranoid fantasies over random chaos. We have a mental health crisis so profound that therapy itself has become a middle-class status symbol, a new secular priesthood offering absolution through affirmation. You're valid. You're enough. You're worthy. These are the mantras of therapeutic culture. They sound compassionate. But notice what they don't say. They don't say you're good because that would require a standard of goodness external to the self. They don't say you're right because that would require truth claims. They say you're valid because validity is self-referential. It means your feelings matter, not that your beliefs correspond to reality. This is vanity in its purest form. Not vanity in the sense of narcissism, though there's plenty of that. Vanity in the biblical sense, meaninglessness, emptiness, vapor. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity, said the preacher in Ecclesiastes. The pursuit of things that can't satisfy, the endless cycle of desire and disappointment. And the data suggests we know this at some level. In 2021, the Pew Research Center found that 49% of Americans said they felt their life had no clear sense of purpose or meaning. Among those aged 18 to 29, the number was even higher. These aren't people who lack material comfort. They're people who lack what Viktor Frankl called man's search for meaning, the sense that their existence matters in some larger story. Frankl, a psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, argued that meaning was more fundamental than pleasure. In the concentration camps, he observed that those who survived weren't necessarily the strongest or smartest, but those who had something to live for, some meaning they refused to abandon. His conclusion: he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Modern therapeutic culture has inverted this. It says, find your why by eliminating the how, by removing everything that causes discomfort. Don't like your job? Quit. Relationship difficult? Leave. Identity not working? Change it. The assumption is that comfort equals meaning, that if we just remove enough friction, we'll be happy. But meaning requires friction. It requires struggle, sacrifice, commitment to something beyond the self. The paradox is that the relentless pursuit of happiness makes happiness impossible. Because happiness, real happiness, deep satisfaction, comes not from getting what you want, but from wanting what supports human flourishing. And this brings us back to virtue. The classical and Christian virtues weren't arbitrary rules, they were, imperfectly, attempts to codify what actually supports human flourishing across time and culture. Courage lets you face necessary challenges. Temperance prevents you from destroying yourself with excess. Wisdom helps you distinguish good from bad. Justice binds you to others in reciprocal relationship. Faith, hope, and charity connect you to transcendent meaning. These virtues were hard. They required discipline, self-denial, submission to standards beyond your feelings. They weren't about being nice, they were about being good. And goodness often requires saying no to yourself and others in service of what's true and right. But we've replaced virtue with niceness, with not causing offense, with validating everyone's feelings. We've replaced wisdom with information. We've replaced courage with safety. We've replaced temperance with self-care. We've replaced justice with equity theater, performative gestures that signal moral purity without requiring sacrifice. And we wonder why it's not working. Here's a concrete example. In the 1960s, the Moynihan Report warned that family breakdown in African American communities would lead to social catastrophe. It was pilloried as racist, shelved, ignored. The concern was dismissed because it implied judgment, implied that some family structures were better than others, implied that individual choices had collective consequences. Fast forward 50 years, and family breakdown has spread across all demographics. The out-of-wedlock birth rate among whites exceeds what it was among blacks when Moynihan wrote his report. And everywhere family breaks down, the social pathologies follow. Poverty, crime, educational failure, mental health crises. But we can't talk about it honestly because that would require saying some choices are better than others, that stable two-parent families produce better outcomes than the alternatives, that personal virtue has collective consequences. We can't say that because it might make people feel judged, might cause discomfort, might imply that your truth isn't as good as the truth. So instead we medicalize it, therapize it, throw money at the symptoms while refusing to address the causes. We treat the collapse of meaning-making institutions as a mental health crisis, requiring pharmaceutical intervention, rather than a moral and spiritual crisis requiring a recovery of shared values and commitments. In 2019, the CDC reported that 1 in 6 Americans were on psychiatric medication. Think about that. 1 in 6. These aren't people with severe mental illness. These are ordinary people so anxious, so depressed, so unable to cope with the basic challenges of existence that they need chemical assistance. And the numbers have only gotten worse since COVID. Now, I'm not anti-medication. For some people, it's life-saving. But when 1/6 of your population needs psychiatric drugs to function, that's not a medical problem. That's a civilization problem. That's what happens when you build a society around principles that violate human nature, that sever people from community, meaning, and transcendence. The Romans had a similar moment. In the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, Stoic philosophy became wildly popular among the elite. Why? Because the old gods were dead, the old myths were no longer believable, and people needed some framework for living. Stoicism offered that rational, practical, focused on what you could control. It was enormously influential, produced some of the greatest philosophical writing in history. But it didn't save Rome, because philosophy, however sophisticated, can't replace religion's social functions. It can guide individuals, but it can't bind communities. It can provide personal meaning, but it can't create shared rituals, shared sacred stories, shared commitments that survive personal convenience. When Marcus Aurelius died, his son Commodus became emperor. Commodus had access to all his father's wisdom, all the resources of Stoic philosophy. He became one of Rome's worst tyrants, fighting as a gladiator while the empire burned. Philosophy without culture, without institutions, without shared virtue is just intellectual vanity. We're making the same mistake. We think we can have the benefits of traditional morality, community, purpose, meaning, without the cost, without submission to anything greater than the self. Without the tragic wisdom that some pleasures must be denied, some freedoms constrained, some truths accepted even when uncomfortable. We can't. Human nature doesn't work that way. We're tribal creatures who need belonging, need meaning, need to believe our sacrifices matter. When traditional institutions provided that, we chafed against them, saw their injustices, their hypocrisies, their stifling effects on individual flourishing. We weren't wrong. Those institutions often were oppressive. But we made a mistake. We thought we could tear down the old without building anything new. We thought freedom from was enough, that we didn't need freedom for. We thought individual liberation would automatically produce human flourishing. It didn't. It produced the most anxious, depressed, lonely, atomized generation in recorded history, living in material abundance and psychological poverty. So, what's the answer? I don't have a simple one, and anyone who claims to is selling something. But I think the pattern of history suggests some principles. First, we need to recover the idea that some things are objectively true and good, not just true for me. That's not oppression. That's the foundation of any coherent morality. Second, we need to rebuild mediating institutions, the families, churches, civic organizations, tight-knit communities that stand between the individual and the state and provide belonging and purpose. Third, we need to reclaim the tragic vision, the understanding that life involves suffering and limitation, that not all problems can be solved, that maturity means accepting what you can't change and working courageously on what you can. And fourth, we need to subordinate the self to something greater. Not in the sense of crushing individuality, but in the sense of recognizing that meaning comes from connection, from commitment, from serving purposes that transcend personal happiness. The Romans who saved Rome, temporarily, in the 4th and 5th centuries, weren't the sophisticated urbanites who mocked old virtues. They were people like Augustine, who built new institutions and new visions of virtue on the ruins of the old. They were monastics who preserved knowledge and community through the Dark Ages. They were families who held together and passed on values, even as empires collapsed around them. We're not Rome. Our challenges are different, but the fundamental human needs are the same. We need meaning. We need belonging. We need to believe our choices matter. We need virtue, not vanity. The question is whether we'll learn the lessons of history or repeat them, whether we'll rebuild on solid foundations or continue building on sand, whether we'll recover the wisdom that some things matter more than our momentary happiness. The students who applauded in 1965 when the professor declared traditional morality dead, their grandchildren are the ones with the depression and anxiety and suicide rates. That's not a coincidence. It's a consequence. When you sever people from meaning, from transcendence, from virtue, you don't get liberation. You get collapse, inner if not outer. But here's the hope. History also shows that these collapses aren't permanent. Civilizations die, but their wisdom can be recovered. We can choose differently. We can rebuild. We can relearn the hard truths that virtue requires sacrifice, that meaning requires commitment, that flourishing requires more than just feeling good. The choice is ours. The pattern is clear. The question is whether we'll have the courage to see it and the wisdom to act. Thanks for watching Professor Archive. If this resonated with you, a super thanks genuinely helps us keep making content like this. Let me know in the comments what you think. Is the West in moral collapse or moral evolution? And seriously, I want to know, what do you do for a living? I'm fascinated by who's drawn to these deep historical questions. Until next time, keep digging into the past to understand the present.